Welcome to Holy Trinity Adult Forum. My name is Russ Hilliard. It's my privilege to be here for this interview with our former pastor, Lynn Opterbeck. This is part one of what we intend to be a two-part series. We are calling it Pastor O Goes to Concord. And if some of you who are watching and listening do not understand the significance of that title, I think that's probably good news for Holy Trinity. It means we have some younger members of the congregation. I'll be asking a series of questions to interview Pastor O. We intend this to last each part 20 minutes or so, and there'll be an opportunity for some live question and answers following that. So welcome, Pastor Opterbeck, and thank you very much for taking the time to share part of your life story with us.
Thanks, Russ. I look forward to
it. You know, a lot of folks watching know you well, but there may well be a number that don't. And so I just thought I would have you spend a couple of minutes describing your life journey that led to your being called to Holy Trinity in 2000.
Sure, I'd be happy to. I was born in Chicago and grew up there on the northwest side of Chicago. And after high school, went to St. Olaf College in Minnesota. And I was very active in my church growing up in things called Luther League, the youth group, as well as other activities there. It was a very large church. There were 80 in my confirmation class. So I was used to that kind of a dynamic. But at St. Olaf then, I majored in social psychology. And there is where I met Nina. And we were married in 1965, my first year at the seminary. Went to Luther Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota. It seemed as though most of the pastors most of the St. Olaf grads who wanted to become pastors went to Luther Seminary. Some went to other seminaries, but most went to Luther. In my home church, I think I was about the 22nd pastor coming out of my home church. It had quite a history of sending, at that time, men to the seminary.
I was going to ask you, when you mentioned that, how can you identify when it was you made the decision to attend seminary?
I think I look back on in 8th grade, they had graduated from elementary school in 8th grade in Chicago, and they had a little paper there that said, "What do you want to be?" And I said, "A pastor."
Oh, and goodness.
So I think it was kind of a growing awareness, both in high school and college. I thought of other possibilities, but always came back to being a pastor. And so when I went to St. Olaf, that was really sort of the direction.
And I'm sorry I interrupted you. Go ahead.
No, not at all. They didn't. You could major in anything. You could be a math major and go on to a seminary. That didn't really matter. The one important thing was you would try to take Greek, a couple of years of Greek in college, so you didn't have to take it at seminary. That was a requirement.
Yeah.
But otherwise, was not.
And then I know that Holy Trinity was your third call as a pastor.
Right.
What were the first two?
Right. Well, I interned in Farmington, Minnesota, which is now a suburb of Minneapolis, but back then was really a rural kind of farming community or semi-farming community. And that was very instrumental in learning how to be a pastor. But then at seminary, I graduated seminary in 1969 and received the call at that time to Portland, Maine, First Lutheran Church in Portland, Maine. The process in those days was that the seniors from all of the seminaries would have their resumes or their record sent in, and there would be a meeting of the district presidents, now bishops, and it was like the NFL draft. The president, whichever district hosted it, that district president got the first choice. And then I'm not sure what the order was in order to choose, but they would choose, and our assumption was that we would go out to the Dakotas, where most of my classmates went, and we had asked though to you got to make three choices. I don't think that usually made any difference. And our one choice was that we not go to Minneapolis or Chicago, where both of us were from. I was from Minneapolis, I was from Chicago. And that we would go to New England. And I had worked at a camp in Hillsborough, New Hampshire, after my senior year in college. And my dad was from the Boston area. And so I had some relatives in the Boston area, but not particularly close in that sense. But so that we said, without knowing what we really meant, would like to go to New England, without knowing there were no Lutherans in New England.
We're precious few.
That's right. That was a little side effect. But we met with the district president our senior year once we were assigned to the Eastern District, which went from Florida to Maine. And so we met with the district president in the Minneapolis airport for about an hour and a half. And that was his meeting. That was our meeting. And he said, well, maybe we can do something about New England. But then kind of probably in June or maybe May of that year, we got a phone call from this congregation in Portland, Maine. It was an old Norwegian congregation, about 90 years old at that time. And
you mean the church, not the members?
Right. There were some members that age too.
Okay.
And through that, we had the phone interview, and then we received a letter of call. There were no in-person interviews in those days.
Interesting.
So far away and all that kind of stuff.
Wow. And you were there for quite a number of years.
Yes, we were in Portland for 13 years, and both of our daughters were born in Portland. Portland was a strong congregation. We developed the intern program there, had I think 4 or 5 interns while we were in Portland. We also did a refugee resettlement, and it was a time of Vietnam and all of that kind of turmoil. And so at the end of the war, there were many, many refugees to be resettled, and we signed up, and we were the first sponsor of any Vietnamese in Maine. And that raised a number of different issues because we didn't speak very good Vietnamese.
Yes.
But it worked out. It worked out very well.
Well, I know it led to a lifelong love of Maine for you.
Absolutely. While we were there, we bought a little wooden tent, we call it, a little cabin, which we still own and go to. No indoor plumbing, but it does have electricity. So we think we're in the lap of luxury there.
Yeah, wonderful. So 13 years in Portland.
And that went well, but at that point, we kind of sensed the need for a new challenge. And so I talked to the bishop at that time and said, well, I really need to figure out where to go and what to do. And he said, well, you can't figure that out without a call. You have to have a call in order to really kind of search your mind and your heart about your next stop. And so we received a couple of different calls at that time. Earlier, I had a call to Orlando, Florida, some kind of places like that. But we received this call to this mission congregation. It was 2.5 years old in Centerville, Virginia, which is suburban Washington, D.C. We were about 25 miles from the White House.
And when you say mission congregation, what exactly does that mean?
That means it's not self-supporting. And so we were getting about $40,000 or $50,000 a year from the national church. And that would be, of course, a diminishing kind of support, hopefully. At that point, it was the most expensive mission start ever in the American Lutheran Church because of the cost of land and everything else.
Wow.
And so we accepted
were you
that
there
call.
Were you there at the beginning?
And no, it was about 2.5 years old.
Okay.
The building had just been finished. The first phase had just been finished. So we went, there were concrete floors. It was We had all sorts of things we had to do to meet the requirements of Fairfax County. I can remember on a day that was 95 degrees, planting trees all over the place to meet the county regulations. So it was really a grassroots operation.
Wow.
One.
Yeah. And so you were there, what, 1983 or 4 or so until 2000?
Right, 1982.
82. Okay.
We were there 18 years.
So you were planting the trees in the warm weather.
Right. But the congregation grew very, very rapidly. We were in a suburban area, and we were really the only congregation in this very large housing development. I think there were 3,000 homes in that housing development. And we became the congregation of the community. And so we're very much a Lutheran congregation, but with this community kind of input. And so a lot of our work was in the community in various ways. I was on the global mission committee of the synod at that point. And one of the things we did was try to establish a connection between our synod and some overseas synod. And we did some brainstorming, and we thought maybe one of the ways to do that, instead of having missionaries come and visit us, was for us to go and visit a missionary. And so we decided to do that as a committee, as a synod, and we decided to go to South Africa and Namibia. Namibia was a Lutheran country.
Interesting.
As a German and Finnish missionaries. And so we established a relationship and were very welcomed into Namibia. It was under the occupation at that point of South Africa. And so it was a very political kind of situation. Because we were in Washington, we did have access to a lot of national as well as international kind of contacts. And so I can remember walking in protest around the South African embassy with signs saying "Free Namibia" and things like that. And,
goodness. Well, we know that you end up going back to Africa as part of your work as Lutheran pastor. But okay, interesting. So you were there for eight 18 years.
It started back there. With Namibia, and I went to Namibia 4 different times, bringing delegations from our synod, and doing a sabbatical there in 1995. And so that, I think, really really whet my appetite for 2 things. One for social justice, and the other was for international church kind of contacts, mission contacts.
And so I know that we could have a whole separate program sometime about your maybe your experiences. I know that. Okay,
that was really fun. But as I said, the church really grew very rapidly. So we had staff. I had an associate pastor. We had a youth worker. We had a volunteer coordinator, and it was a very, very, very active church. But after 18 years, I just there were some opportunities to grow and do some different things. But I didn't think I was quite ready to take those on at that point. And so then the call came to come to Portsmouth, to Newington, to Holy Trinity, and we found that to be a very inviting call.
And that was around sometime during 2000?
That was the beginning of 2000, right.
Okay, yeah.
So we came, and I had known Paul Lindstrom, the interim pastor, from my time in Portland, Maine. He was in Wayland, Massachusetts. And so we knew each other. And so I sat down with Paul and heard the inside scoop about Holy Trinity. And it just sounded like it would be a good fit.
And so you were there just about 11 years, just shy of 11 years?
At Holy Trinity, yes.
Holy Trinity, yeah.
Right, right. Oh. And Holy Trinity had its ups and downs, but Paul had really stabilized it. I think he was interim for about 3 years, or almost 3 years, which is a long interim, but which was needed. And so when we came, I think everybody was really ready to step forward and to move ahead.
Well, we know you had a great 11 years there. Are there any, I want to get to the part about your decision to go to Concord, as the title of the program says, but what fondest memories or significant memories would you share with folks about your time at Holy Trinity, understanding that a number of people watching the program were not members during your time?
Right, right. Well, the congregation, in its letter of call, or as we talked in the interviews, said it really wanted to develop more lay leadership, wanted to really grow in many ways, and it was ready to kind of change its structure. It had the council meetings used to go on to midnight or beyond, and they didn't think that was such a good idea. And so I had done that at St. Andrew in Centerville, and so I was ready to try to do that again here at Holy Trinity, and just found people just ready to go. All they needed was a little bit of an incentive, direction, and they were ready. And so some of the things we did, I think, that were important was we began to focus more outward instead of inward. And so with Joe Lagala, who was a professor at UNH and a Tanzanian person, his dad was a pastor in Tanzania, I asked Joe, would his dad's congregation in rural Tanzania be at all interested in trying to form a kind of a partnership with Holy Trinity? And he said he'd get back to me, which he did, and said, oh yeah, they'd be very interested in that. And so we began to form that kind of tentative partnership. And then I went over to Tanzania, met Joe Lugala there, and we visited the congregation in Isimani, and then began to realize that the synod there in Tanzania was related to the St. Paul, Minnesota synod. They call it companion synods. And so we realized that we really had to do this not just on our own between Joe's dad and myself, but really to do this with the synod approval. And so we got that approval, and that relationship started.
And continues.
And continues. And it's been a very meaningful relationship to both congregations. And then just about that time or a little later, Mike Gass and Christina Dulcino went down to Guatemala and relieved to an orphanage down there and relieved the workers down there so they could take some vacation. And when they came back, they saw all sorts of needs. And so we said, well, maybe we should kind of try to do some things there in Guatemala as well. And so Holy Trinity began to change from very inward focused to very outward focused. Did some things in the Portsmouth Dover community as well. And also at that time got into the internship program, which was very good for everybody. I think we just enjoyed teaching these students to become pastors, and the people at Holy Trinity really took on ownership of that program.
But then there came a time when you decided to retire.
Right. When we came to Holy Trinity, I said, well, I have 10 or so years that I'll commit to. And then, there came time, and I was 67 when I retired in January of 2011. Right.
So what did you, when I'm leading up to, I know that you ran for and were elected to the New Hampshire legislature in the fall of 2016. So how did you occupy those immediate 5 years post-retirement, and what led to your deciding to run for public office?
Couple of things, I guess. One is during that time I served as an interim pastor in Salem, New Hampshire, and the congregation in Salem had a state representative as well as a state senator, and so I talked to them about what they were doing just out of interest. I had never been, as a pastor, you're very apolitical, but during retirement, then I also volunteered in a couple of the presidential years to make phone calls on behalf of the candidates. And so that, that doesn't get you into anything, but I guess somehow my name was recognized or something. So I received a phone call in, I think it was May of 2016, asking me if I would be willing to run for the state legislature.
Did it feel at all like a, not the same significance, maybe a calling, in the same way being called to the ministry?
Yeah, it was certainly something I never ever thought about doing. And it came out of the blue, and my response was, well, why don't you find someone else to do that? You know? And I said, if you're having troubles, give me a call back, but find someone else.
Was it an open seat in your district where you?
Yeah, the representative who in my district was retiring. She had finished. She had served 2 terms. And so then I finally said, yes, I'll try that. And not knowing what I was trying, really, I think like many of us, not following state government very closely. And so began to try to read a little bit about state government. And there was the Dover Democrats have a strong committee, and so they kind of helped me along. And so there was no primary election, which was nice. There was no one else.
You were the only candidate for the Democratic Party.
Correct.
Okay.
But then in the fall, I did have another challenger, a young man who was also running for that position, who was Republican. And so part of the process is you make up these little, I was going to have one here, but I don't, palm cards, these little cards that probably people are familiar with, someone knocking on the door and giving it something that describes what you want to do and how you want to act if you're elected. And one of the things that I was most interested in was trying to create a dialogue between the 2 parties. There didn't seem to be a lot of dialogue going on. And,
this even in 2016.
Right.
Yeah.
So then I was elected. Then also in that process, you get your road signs and you try to knock on doors and see if people will put up a sign for you. And then you canvass the area. I'm Dover Point, so you simply go around and knock on doors and say, I'm Lynn Opterbeck and I'm running for the House of Representatives. In an election such as that,
I mean, are there debates or candidate nights, or what campaign activities, in addition to canvassing door to door, were involved in?
It varies greatly between different areas of the state. But in Dover, there was very little. Trying to think of who sponsored it. One of the civic organizations, maybe it was the League of Women Voters, I can't remember, sponsored a night at City Hall where all the candidates came and got 3 minutes to present. And then the newspaper would do an interview, but that was about it. There really wasn't much publicity, so to speak.
Was there any aspect of, campaigning or decisions about what to do and what to say that just were influenced by your life and faith?
I think I really enjoyed knocking on doors and listening to people. What do you think is important in government? And very, like most people, they would be very short. They'd take my card and say thank you, but I'd say, is there anything you're interested in? No, not much. And there's always confusion about what the state legislature does. Can we influence income tax, or can we decide who's going to be on the Supreme Court in Washington and things like that the federal government deals with, and not the state government. So there's really a pretty small or a little understanding of what the state government actually does.
Well, you've obviously learned a lot more about that in the last 4 years yourself.
That's for sure. When I was... So I was elected then in...
you were elected in November of 16,
2016. They have an orientation meeting for new legislators at the State House in December. And you sit down and they try to tell you this is how things work. It's a 2-day workshop, very thorough and very interesting. Of course, there are 400 legislators in the state of New Hampshire. It's the largest
in the House of Representatives.
The House, right? The largest single body, other than the U.S. Congress, which has 435 members, I believe. And so
I think probably the only other one is Parliament in England, but
yes,
other than that, we're right at the top of the list in terms of numbers.
yes, that's right. That's
Yeah.
right. And of course, the salary is such, it's $100 a year salary. So it really is a volunteer position for all intents and purposes.
And does that make it a better, based on your experience, does that make it a better institution that it's volunteers as opposed to salaried?
I think there are strengths and weaknesses. In some ways, it's better because you're certainly not going to get rich. So there's nobody that's there to try to pad their pockets a little bit. That's a healthy thing. In some ways, it's not insofar as there are a lot of rookies always. There are a lot of first-term legislators who don't really understand. So you're not as informed, perhaps, as you would be in another state where there are maybe 50 legislators. You don't have any support staff. I have a locker to put my coat in, and I have a file drawer to put my other material. That's the extent of, and a seat to sit in at sessions.
And what about, is there any, if you wanted to introduce a bill, is there assistance in drafting and the other procedures involved in submitting a bill?
Yeah, the legislature itself has any number of full-time people who will, if I wanted to submit a bill, I would kind of write out what I wanted, and I would go in and meet with the bill drafting area of the legislature, and they would sit down and say, well, we've already got bills covering this, or that's new, let us look it up. And they would. And
this office is, you're describing it is bipartisan. It's an office that serves members in both parties. Yeah. Right.
And so they really know what they're doing. And I think they can, in some cases, they would look up legislation that would be passed in other states that was doing what you wanted it to do. And they'd say, well, how does this work? Does this fit or not? Or something brand new? And that's okay too.
And you were assigned to a committee that first term?
You got to make three choices. You were assigned, but you got to say, these would be my preferences. And as I remember, I think my preferences were criminal justice and public safety was the third one, which I was appointed to finally. Children's law was, I thought that children family law would be an interesting area because of my experience. That might be, and education I thought would be an interesting one. But they assign you. And there are 20 committees in the state legislature. And every delegate is assigned, every representative is assigned to one committee.
Oh, I see. One committee and one committee only.
Yeah, there's a couple of exceptions where someone's on the finance committee as well as another committee, but that's very rare.
The reason I say the state Senate, the other house of the legislature, has 24 members and perhaps an equal number of committees. So the senators serve on many different committees. That's
right. I think most of them serve on 3 committees or 4 committees. They combine some of our committees into a single committee. Which is kind of interesting.
And of course, in 2016, your election for the biennium beginning in January 17, you were in the minority party in the House of Representatives. Is that right?
Yes, I think the majority leader and the minority leader get together to assign members to committees, and the majority leader has the ultimate decision in anything like that. But we were in minority, and each committee makeup is the same percentage as the overall House. So if the House is 60-40 or 55-45, then that committee is the same percentage.
I see.
And so that works out fairly well. And the committee chairman and vice president and vice chairman are from the majority party in most cases.
Okay. And so you served that first term on criminal justice as a member of the minority party.
Correct.
Yeah.
And you know, you've been taught now. This seminar helped you, and then they've had several seminars following up to say, here's how you file a bill, or here's what you do with this or that. There are committee caucuses where they say, this is the stance of our committee on this particular bill. We're for it, we're against it, whatever the case would be. And so,
are you in? Forgive me if I ask a question that is too overloaded, but are you instructed how to vote?
We are given, for instance, at our caucus, we have a caucus before every session.
Mm-hmm.
And in the caucus, which usually lasts about an hour, they'll go through the bills that will be dealt with at that session. And they will say, here's where we stand as a party. Always in our party, as we would leave, they would say, vote your conscience and vote for what your constituents stand for.
Okay.
And they were very clear on that, and saying that you can go against what the party recommends, but that's not a problem.
Okay, all right. I agree with an observation you made the first part of our interview, that a lot of people aren't as knowledgeable about the workings of state government and legislature as they are, I think, of the federal government. And so you obviously deal with bills on a number of subjects, and ultimately the biannual budget for the state is something that the House and the Senate both have to approve, and the governor sign as well. Is that right?
Yes, it is. One of the interesting things is in New Hampshire, any bill that is submitted has to be heard. It gets to a committee, and the committee then decides whether to pass it on to the whole House as ought to pass, or whether it decides to basically table it or study it, or whether it passes it on saying not ready for legislation.
So unlike stories we hear about the federal government and other places, bills don't just get buried and die without seeing the light of day. Okay, interesting.
And consequently, we do have some very strange bills occasionally. We have about, I think the average is about 900 bills a session to look at. So, of course, those are assigned then to 20 different committees. So that makes it a little bit more manageable, but not entirely. For instance, I'm on the Criminal Justice Public Safety Committee, and we are responsible for the state prisons, the two prisons for men, the one in Berlin and the one in Concord, as well as the state prison for women. And because I'm on the committee, I've toured those prisons, which is interesting thing in and of itself. We also are in charge of the state police. And so I've been to the State Police Academy and seen the training that they go through. And we're also in charge of fire prevention, firefighting. And so there's also a state academy for EMS firefighters in Concord. That too is a very, very interesting place. But those are sort of the larger groups that we oversee.
Well, you must be watching current events involving police and fires with some perspectives the rest of us don't have.
Yeah, it's interesting. We passed legislation this past term, before all of this really came to the forefront, on having police themselves, of having a civilian oversight committee, and some of these issues that are being dealt with now throughout the nation, we had already sort of looked at and passed legislation that was, I think, very good legislation in those areas.
Interesting. Well, so that's a broad range of subjects that your Criminal Justice and Public Safety Committee dealt with. And then were there any, just coming out of that first session, any particular successes, frustrations, observations you'd like to tell us about?
Well, you know, our committee deals with a variety of things, never to be bored. We deal with marijuana. And certainly the last 4 years, the whole idea of legalizing marijuana in New Hampshire has
Right.
been pretty central in our committee for the most part. And so we've had hearings of which 200 or 300 people would come out. Anyone is welcome to come out and sit in the gallery at a session, at a house session, or to sit in the gallery at a committee meeting. And in the gallery at the committee meeting, the public is welcome to speak.
Right.
So if you felt strongly about marijuana, one way or the other, you could come and speak.
Huh.
And what's so interesting, again, with all of these laws, is that it's never quite, do you legalize marijuana or not legalize marijuana? It's if you do legalize marijuana, how do you sell it? What's the penalties for this or that? How do you regulate it? Where does the revenue come from and go to? And so everything becomes very, very complex. And so, for instance, I have basically voted against the legalization of marijuana with the knowledge that it will be legalized one day in New Hampshire. But because I felt we did not have a very clear structure to try to regulate the growing of the plant as well as the selling of the plant. So we spent hours and hours on something like that.
Yeah, I will tell you from my limited exposure, my impression is that the New Hampshire legislative process is one of the most open to the public forms anywhere in the country. That your committee meetings are open. Anyone is welcome to attend and sign the list saying they wish to speak, and they'll be heard.
Yes. The only thing that's closed to the public are caucuses.
Right.
The caucus of either the Democrats or the Republicans, or a committee caucus of Republicans or Democrats. Those are closed. But anything that's open, that's passing legislation, is open to the public. That's been one of the difficulties with COVID. And when the State House was closed in March, of how do you hold a committee meeting that's open to the public?
Yeah.
And so we've struggled with that issue.
Yeah.
And still are.
You still are, I'm sure. But in any event, your experiences in the first session, which is the biennium, the regular session, and then the second session of the biennium, they were such that you made a decision to run for re-election.
Right. To run for election in New Hampshire to the State House takes $2. You simply go to your town clerk, city clerk, and you sign some documents, and you pay $2, and your name is on the ballot.
Yeah,
if there are more than one name on the ballot for your party, then there's a primary. And if you're the only one, then you go right on to the election.
Was there any, I'm assuming that as you were working your way through that first session as a freshman representative, you pretty quickly started thinking about, do I wish to do this again?
Yes. Depends on which day you're talking about, of course. One day you may feel, oh, this is very good. And the next day you kind of get discouraged.
So in the summer of 2018, you had to come to a decision.
Right. By June 1st, I think it is.
Yeah.
And I decided, it's just really learning the ropes, so to speak. And so that's the difficulty with a one term, is you really don't understand what's happening. It's like going to high school. It takes you to your sophomore or junior year before you figure out what's going on. And so I did decide to run that second term. I had a different opponent, but was elected.
You have no primary challenge, though, I assume?
In either time, right.
Okay, yeah. A different opponent, though, in the general election.
Right. Again, a young man, and you have opportunities. It was fun when you're standing outside the polling place. You get to know your opponent a little bit that way, and that's enjoyable for the most part.
Yeah.
Again, the topics that we dealt with, I wanted to be on criminal justice. That was the most rewarding part of being a representative, was the committee work. Yeah. The sessions themselves, you're sitting there with 400 people, and a bill is brought up. A number of bills are brought up on what they call the consent calendar. Those are bills that come out of the committee, basically 20-0 or 19-1 or something like that. So it's very clear that a committee has taken a stance on that bill.
And so that a bill such as that is not then debated on the floor of the House, or just a whole batch of them are adopted in one fell swoop.
Correct. And any legislator can pull a bill off of that consent calendar. So if it was your bill and you really feel passionate about it, and the committee voted 19-1 to not support it, you can always pull it back and say, well, I think it should be supported for these reasons.
And have a chance to address the full body.
Right. And so and in the committee is where it's really debated. You hear experts testify, you hear various state officials testify. There are lobbyists that will come in and testify. For instance, as far as marijuana was concerned, there was a whole pro-marijuana lobby, and they would present papers to our committee saying why we should vote yes for this, and then there was also groups that would say no, you shouldn't vote for it.
Is there, the lobbyist has such a negative connotation generally? Is it all negative, or are lobbyists helpful to the process and understanding the issues and the choices?
In many cases, they're very helpful because they're very knowledgeable about a particular issue. It does help in many cases to have lobbyists from either side of the issue, so you get a kind of a balance. In the Criminal Justice Committee, we don't have many lobbyists. We have some, but not many. And so we're listening more to state officials, the head of the Department of Corrections or the head of the police academy, who are saying how these bills will affect them. But other cases will have a group from the defense attorneys, prosecuting attorneys, who would be speaking for or against a particular bill.
Yeah. When you don't have, a large paid staff like in Congress or in larger states, you need to gather your information in different ways.
That's right. And the lobbyists are a great help in that way, particularly for our committee, because they would have some background and some knowledge of what's going on in different places and some historical knowledge. And that would be very helpful usually. Yeah.
And so I don't want to forget to ask, your second term in the legislature after you were elected in November of 2018, you were now serving in the majority party. And is that different? I assume it is. And how is that different?
Well, in many cases, your position is going to win. Your party is going to win that particular vote. And so that does make a difference. You try to be fair. One of the difficulties I've found in Concord is that neither party consults the other party as they're creating legislation. Sort of like we're the only ones who understand this, and here it is. This is our bill. This is the way we see things. Instead of really kind of in the creation of a bill, as the bill is written, try to get both sides involved. And I think that's one of the weaknesses. It's certainly a weakness in Washington, and is in Concord as well.
But how is there any, based on your experience, how might that be addressed? Is there? We live in a very difficult partisan time, obviously, and it would be nice if there were ways to make the legislative ideas more bipartisan and have broader support.
The committees are the one area where it seems like there's good communication, or at least better communication. And so once a bill is submitted to a committee, it is the committee's bill. And so you could submit a bill saying, well, we're going to change the yellow stripes on the highways to green stripes. Well, okay, that bill would come to us, but then we debate that and talk about that in the committee. And the committee may come up with the idea, well, really purple stripes would work out better, even though your bill was to make them, orange stripe. And if the committee felt that was the case, we would amend the bill. It's our bill now. It's not your bill any longer. It's our bill. And we would amend it. And that's done fairly cooperatively in most cases. There are some committees, it's always a party vote. I was
going to ask you that. Are they often committee party votes?
Especially about, in our committee, any of the gun bills, anything that had to do with guns, it turned out to be pretty straight party votes. But most of the other votes were not. And so we had bills to deal with human trafficking. And we had, for a pastor to sit there as sex workers come in and testify was a rather eye-opening experience.
Oh, I bet it was.
But on those kind of bills, you try to come to a consensus, and usually you could. Again, marijuana was a little bit party-led, but not too much. We have bills on animal cruelty in the committee, and again, you'd come together and you'd kind of talk about what seemed to work out well and what was for the best. And
when you said, I'm sorry, when you said the gun bills were divisive, you mean these were bills relating to, I don't say Second Amendment, that's a federal issue, but the right to have guns and
more were, like a waiting period to purchase a gun.
Ah, okay.
Or we had what was called the red flag bill, which was to be able to intervene if someone is a danger to themselves, going through a crisis, a mental health crisis, and their family felt that they were a danger to themselves, and they could petition the court to say, so-and-so is, endangering himself or our family or the neighborhood or whatever, and we have guns in the house, would you take the guns? Well, as soon as it became taking guns, it became a gun bill, and which was really too bad because it would be temporary and so forth, but it became then a real issue about guns rather than about the health or mental health or intervening to try to help someone so they wouldn't harm themselves or others. The same way with we had bill on about carrying guns on school property. Could you have a gun on school property? And that again became a very much of a Second Amendment. I have a right to carry a gun wherever, and so then whether or not it's on the school property or whether it's helping safety for school kids or teachers, that gets lost immediately. It's all about the gun itself.
Well, it's a microcosm of the experience on the federal level.
Very, very, very much so.
I don't want to leave.
Go ahead. I was going to say, I'd hope that we would be able to make some inroads on prison. That was one of the reasons I wanted to continue on the committee, was to try to make the prison system a little bit more, I'll say user-friendly, but more for rehabilitation rather than for punishment. But boy, that's a huge system, and it's very difficult to change the way it's going. We shorten penalties in many cases. I mean, whether you're going to spend 15 years in jail or 25 years in jail, the punishment is the punishment. And now if that person needs to be out of society for the safety of society, that's a different issue. But if it's really a punishment, the state is paying, we are as taxpayers paying $35,000 a year for each prisoner.
So is that what it is?
They could send them to a pretty good university at $35,000 a year. But that's the reality. So we worked hard on that, but couldn't change as much as I would like.
I want to make sure we leave enough time just to wrap things up a little bit. And by that, I mean, we've already touched on, some thoughts you have about improving the process, making it more bipartisan and maybe more thoughtful in terms of what is good legislation. I know you did not choose to stand for re-election this year. So you served your two full terms in the legislature, and I want to be sure I give you a chance to answer this question. Do you suggest this line of service to others? Did you find it ultimately, positive, interesting, rewarding? What would you say to others who are possibly thinking about serving in the legislature?
I think it's a great opportunity. I would encourage anyone who's thinking about that to talk to their state legislator, to talk to me. I think it's very rewarding. It is time consuming. The sessions go from January to June, And all of those weeks I was gone 2 days a week, some 3 days, once in a while 4 days a week. So
it's pretty difficult. It's pretty difficult for someone who's working for a living.
Yes, very
serve
difficult.
In the legislature. Yeah,
they have to be able to control their schedule in a unique way to be able to do that.
Yeah, and so you'd, on the whole, you found an experience to be recommended to others.
Yes, it became a little bit more frustrating this second term in the way of the divisiveness between the two parties. And there's a group in each party that just is very rambunctious, I guess is a good way to put it.
You're being charitable.
Yeah, yes, right. And it's a small group, probably 30 members on either side. The one group is very identifiable. It calls themselves the Freedom Coalition. And they are just very boisterous and, quite frankly, impolite. And the other group it gets very riled up by that group and responds in like kind. And so that's very discouraging. And so I think a lot of work needs to be done to try to bring the groups together. We have a cafeteria in the State House and have their lunch. I always made it a point to try to eat lunch with members of the other party.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
You know, just to not self-segregate, because that's what goes on a lot, is that there's a lot of kind of self-selection where you're only talking to people that think like you do, and I don't think that's a good and healthy thing.
Breaking bread is an important thing to understanding. And
yes.
Sharing. Yeah. Well, listen, I want to leave time because I suspect those that have been watching have a number of questions to ask about your service or thoughts they have about the legislative process. So I want to leave that time, but I can't tell you how much I appreciate your taking the time to do this, and then hopefully we'll be together live when these two segments are shown at an adult forum. So
thank you.
Much appreciated, and it's so good to spend time with you.
Always good, Russ.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much.